Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Doctrinal Truths, where we will be covering a real-world history of the Book of Mormon. Before we begin, I wanted to make sure that everyone kind of understands what the plan for future episodes looks like, just going forward. The first several episodes of this series, some of you may have been able to kind of already gather, will cover the general real-world history of the Book of Mormon, and that'll be book by book, kind of chronologically. Much of the information I'll be presenting for the next several episodes will be pretty broad, so those of you who have already done a significant amount of Book of Mormon research, some of this might be kind of repetitive to you, but in order to kind of dive into more deeper subjects, I think that it's important to kind of cover all the general history of the Book of Mormon. So, like I said, when we finish this series on the overall history, we'll start to look at the finer details, such as real-world city-site correlations, specific geographic correlations, and other evidences supporting the Book of Mormon. For this episode in particular, we will be covering the early Nephite transition from the Land of Nephi to the Land of Zarahemla, or the period around 400 to 200 BC. So, to start off, we begin in the Book of Jarom. We kind of left off last time at the very beginning of the Book of Jarom. So to give a brief description, having been passed down from Nephi to his younger brother Jacob to his son Enos, the gold plates, which is the record that the Nephites were writing on, the plates end up in the hands of Enos' son named Jarom. So not much is known about this period apart from the fact that the Nephites begin to experience relatively frequent conflict with the Lamanites in the land of Nephi. It's interesting to note that Jarom mentions the Lamanites being exceedingly more numerous than the Nephites. This is a trend that continues pretty much for the rest of the Book of Mormon. The Lamanites are always more numerous than the Nephites. Something John Sorensen talks about in a couple of his books is that logically a civilization that is more productive will usually be more prosperous. And we kind of read in the Book of Mormon that the Nephites were usually self-described as being more prosperous than the Lamanites. However, part of me wonders if that's just because of relative ignorance of what was going on outside of Nephite culture. We have hundreds of thousands of Lamanites, well-organized armies, Lamanite cities, so it's pretty obvious that the Lamanites were a civilization in their own respect. Logically, the only other plausible way that the Lamanites could have become exceedingly more numerous than the Nephites in the space of only 200 years since Nephi and his family landed in the New World is if the original immigrant group from Jerusalem intermixed with populations already on this continent. We know that Laman and Lemuel, the older brothers of Nephi, kind of gave off a power-hungry vibe from the very beginning of the book. They were very spiteful and tended to ignore the signs of the Lord. So it wouldn't be surprising if when they arrived in the New World, they kind of used their new technologies that they brought with them and influence to kind of take control of local populations. So this conflict continues across generations from Jerom's son Omni, and then Amaron, Chemish, Abinadam, and Amalekite, each of whom are Nephite record keepers, and they keep the records over the space of several hundred years in the immediate land of Nephi. As we discussed last episode, that is most likely the city of Kaminalhuyu, which is a large pre-Columbian Mayan city located in the valley of Guatemala. Fortifications are described as being built, weapons of war being made, including what the Book of Mormon describes as the pointed arrow, the dart, and the javelin. Each of these weapons had a home in Mesoamerica for thousands of years, dating all the way back to Olmec times. And some of those, as you can see here, can be seen in this image. You have the Makwawit, which is a pre-Columbian sword. Obviously, that was designed in various different fashions. You had the bow and arrow, the spear. You had what we call a atlatl, which is like a spear thrower. And then this probably wouldn't have existed around the time of the Nephites. This is an axe with a copper head, but they did have shields. But yeah, as we can see, warfare was a common occurrence and prevalent throughout all of Mesoamerica, dating back thousands of years. So When we move into a real world context for these chapters, we see a really striking correlation between what is described and where we place the immediate land of Nephi in the Valley of Guatemala. As discussed in the previous episode, again, the primary candidate for the city of Nephi is Kaminalhuyu. At the time, Kaminalhuyu was comprised of various communities and ethnicities, and almost living in various different what they called barrios, which is various different wards and communities scattered throughout the city related to their own ethnic or cultural group. So an immigrant group such as Nephi and his family would have really found a welcome home here at around the time of 500 BC. They would have likely settled in one of these barrios, or at least maybe even made their own barrio, and lived there until what the Book of Mormon and what history tells us, until the city of Kaminalhuyu began to become more centralized and expanded. Starting around 400 BC and lasting till around 200 BC, the city starts to become increasingly more autocratic and seemingly suffering from bouts of warfare and violence. So if we look at this from the perspective of the Nephites in the Book of Mormon, we can really see outside peoples infringing on their community and culture, which is what they were really trying to protect from the beginning. And this may have been the result of people outside of the Valley of Guatemala moving in, or simply due to the city of Kaminalhuyu itself becoming more unified under one authority and culture, or it could have even been both. But either way, what the Book of Mormon describes is the traditional Nephite way of life being threatened by outside peoples. So in Kaminalhuyu, we actually begin to see several forms of evidence supporting this violent and political disruption occurring at the time. We've found numerous stela or carved stones featuring iconography depicting war captives, people being forcibly subjugated, etc., from the period between 400 to 200 BC. And we actually see it onwards as well. But with respect to just the Nephite time period, we do see several depictions of violent imagery. There was actually an archaeological study. This is more of a lesser known study that was done by Japanese archaeologists excavating kind of around the site in the 1990s. Obviously, they couldn't excavate a ton because of the encroaching city, the city of Guatemala, kind of encroaching on the site itself. But they actually discovered a pretty massive wall measuring around 25 feet tall, which was erected around a portion of the city at this time. And we know that in the Book of Mormon at the same time, fortifications were being built, and there was a wall around the city of Nephi. This very well could have been a part of the fortification built in defense of the land of Nephi, which were mentioned in the Book of Jarom. So around 250 to 200 BC, this pressure became too much for the Nephites, and we actually see a large group of Nephites led by a man named Mosiah. There are several Mosiahs in the Book of Mormon, but this is the first Mosiah, Mosiah 1, who, quote, being warned of the Lord that he should flee out of the land of Nephi, departed out of the land and into the wilderness. He and his people were eventually led down into the land, which is called the Land of Zarahemla. And we can kind of see this on the map right here. When we put it onto a map, it fits really well with the situation we find in Mesoamerica. So Mosiah and his followers, most likely, they likely immigrated out of the Valley of Guatemala, which you can see here, and traveled in the wilderness until they reached what this is called the Grijalva River, which is a major river in Mesoamerica. In the Book of Mormon, it's called the Sidon River, but this is the Grijalva River, and they likely traveled to its headwaters in the mountains and traveled down until they reached a quote what is called they discovered a people who were called the people of Zarahemla. And then at the time that Mosiah discovered them, they had become exceedingly numerous. So this map and others that I have created will pop up later again for a better understanding of the Book of Mormon. So just be on the lookout for that. But we can kind of see how their trajectory of fleeing out of the land of Nephi or away from Kaminalhuyu fits really well with the geographic description found in the Book of Mormon. So after Mosiah comes down into the land of Zarahemla with his group of people after they flee from the land of Nephi, they meet a group of people who are led by a man named Zarahemla, um, and the we're gonna refer to them as Mulekites from here on out. But the Mulekites, as they're commonly called outside of the Book of Mormon, there's actually uh, no term calling them Mulekites in the Book of Mormon. This is just a term that's kind of come to that's been kind of popularized outside of the Book of Mormon. They deserve their own episode, and they will be covered in significantly more depth in the future. But for the purposes of this video and for understanding Book of Mormon chronology, we'll briefly describe them here. So the people of Zarahemla, presumably named after their leader, Zarahemla, apparently arrived to the New World after fleeing from Jerusalem by boat. They were a descendant of Mulek, which is very possibly, there's been more work done into this. I suggest everyone kind of go do their own research here, but it's very possibly a transliteration of Malchiah from Jeremiah 36:8, or the son of King Zedekiah, who was the last of the Jewish kings before the Babylonian conquest, around 598 BC. So shown here is, in my opinion, one of the most significant archaeological finds supporting the Book of Mormon. You can see it here. This is a seal which dates to around the 7th to 6th centuries BC. The seal reads, Lemalkiyahu ben Hamelech, or Mulek, son of the king. So keep in mind that in Hebrew, names didn't actually contain any vowels. So the name Mulek would appear as MLK, and the same for Malkiyahu or Malchiah. So that's pretty much what we find here on this seal that was found in Jerusalem. Here on this map, you can see the likely route that they took. They likely fled to the Lebanon area, to a city called Sidon, which keep that in mind as we kind of discuss in these future videos, Book of Mormon geography, because that name will pop up again. But they likely traveled to a Phoenician port site. The Phoenicians were ocean goers and maritime peoples who established cities all along the coast and traded through the Mediterranean. They were excellent shipbuilders. They were excellent at navigating the ocean. And it's from here that they likely fled and came across the waters, the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and rounded into what we currently know as Veracruz, or central Mexico. So the Mulekites, as we're calling them, first arrived in the land northward and then traveled south before likely settling at the city of Mulek, or what's most likely known today as the archaeological site of La Venta. Chronologically, they would have arrived and lived during the final centuries with the Jaredite or Olmec civilization from around 600 to 400 BC, where they then integrated into New World culture before abandoning La Venta and traveling up the Grijalva River. You can see that here. The Grijalva River likely would have flowed more to the west and probably more closer to La Venta. It's important to note that the Jaredites and all other Book of Mormon peoples weren't necessarily the entire Maya civilization or the entire Olmec civilization. They were likely just part of that civilization that existed in the area, in whatever fashion. They participated in the culture. As I said last time, and as Brant Gardner said before, we wouldn't be able to tell a Nephite pot or a Jaredite pot from an Olmec pot or a Mayan pot. They participate in the same culture. So when people claim that there's no evidence of the Jaredites or the Nephites, they're expecting evidence in the form of, an inscription saying Nephi was here or the brother of Jared was here, when that's not really, that shouldn't be expected. We rarely find evidence like that in the archaeological record, but we do find a lot of correspondences, which is kind of what we see here in this area. So going back to the Mulekites, we know that they likely lived alongside the Jaredites or the Olmec people for quite a while, as we have a diffusion of some Jaredite culture and names actually into Mulekite society. It's said in the Book of Mormon that when Mosiah and his people discover the people of Zarahemla, they actually couldn't understand them. And John Sorensen mentions this in his book, but linguists have shown that two around 200 300 years, even 400 years is not enough time for an individual's language or a group of people's language to become indistinguishable from another group of people that came from the same area, which in this case would be the land of Jerusalem. So it's strange if the Book of Mormon, or rather if the New World didn't have any people in it at the time of the Book of Mormon, we wouldn't actually see a picture like this. The Mulekites and the Nephites would ideally and would most likely have been able to understand each other. There would have been a few discrepancies in their language, but it would have been like someone in the United States today trying to speak with someone during the Revolutionary War period. We'd still understand them, but we wouldn't likely, but we wouldn't be completely foreign to each other in terms of what we're saying. So there likely was a diffusion of Jaredite language into Mulekite society, and we see that in forms such as the names, etc. So from the city of Mulek, La Venta, this area right here, the Mulekites eventually migrated up into the South Wilderness. So this is pretty much this is another reason why I favor the Grijalva River over over other rivers and regions in Mesoamerica, because really this mountain range right here, the Sierra Madre Mountains, really were the only it's really the only place that fits the Book of Mormon description of traveling up into the South Wilderness. So the Mulekites, probably traveling by river, go up into the South Wilderness and establish a kind of their own string of cities along the river and along this path here. And eventually they travel and reach what we call the city of Zarahemla, where they built the city and eventually met the people of Mosiah. And they brought with them, we find out in the Book of Mormon that they brought with them was a Jaredite stela, which is, as I discussed before, just a stone carving, and a remnant Jaredite king named Coriantumr, who gave a history, both of whom gave a history of the Jaredite people. And we'll kind of be discussing that more in detail in the future. But for all intents and purposes, just understand that the Mulekites integrated with the Olmec people who lived in this area and eventually made their way up into the Grijalva Basin up here in the central Chiapas Depression, and brought with them various forms of Jaredite culture, one of the Jaredite kings, and a carved stela with text on it kind of describing what happened in the Jaredite history. So where exactly did Mosiah meet the Mulekites? We know that they traveled up the river, but and we know that they met each other at the city of Zarahemla, but where exactly was the city of Zarahemla? Well, given the travel time of about 21 days between the city of Zarahemla and the land of Nephi, at a rate of around 9 to 14 miles per day, as discussed in episode 1 of this series, the city of Zarahemla could not be more than about 250 miles northward. As I said before, we get this distance from Alma and his people when they fled the land of Nephi, where it mentions that they traveled about 21 days until they reached the land or the city of Zarahemla. And keep in mind, this group had women, children, elderly, likely sick. They were carrying their possessions with them. So in a mountainous wilderness like that, they would not have been traveling more than 9 to 14 miles per day. We actually find similar travel times among other large groups of people migrating in ancient times. So, as I said, the city could not have been more than about 250 miles away from the land of Nephi. It also had to be on the left side of a major river, as was also discussed in episode 1. The primary city that meets the archaeological and geographical requirements in Mesoamerica is a site known as Santa Rosa, which is now flooded by the Angostura in Chiapas. There's actually a big lake covering this entire region because it was the Grijalva River was dammed up upstream back in the 60s for energy purposes for Mexico. But they did some archaeological excavations here, and it pretty much matches the city of Zarahemla in nearly every requirement. It had close connections with the Gulf Coast, which is where we discussed the Mulekites landed around 598 BC. When Mosiah and his people discovered it, it was a medium-sized growing chiefdom, and this made it ripe for any for a respected and culturally advanced foreigner of Mosiah's status to be made king over. Mosiah brought with him probably new technologies from this area down here. We also know that the people of Zarahemla were excited to meet Mosiah because he brought with them records and a history of his people, which we know dated back to Jerusalem. And the people of Zarahemla, the Mulekites, had forgotten their history because they hadn't made or written any records. So they were extremely excited to see Mosiah and his people, and because of this, he was made king, and they integrated their cultures. Interestingly, when they did excavations here at this site, it's thought that two distinct ethnic groups lived here around the same time. And you can actually see that here in this site map of the city from Sorensen's book, Mormon's Codex. You can see the two distinct living patterns. You've got one on this side and one on this side, and then you've got these three large pyramids and other platforms kind of separating the two groups. And this showed to archaeologists that there was actually two distinct groups of people living on either side of the city. We'll discuss a lot more of the city of Zarahemla and its history in the future and in future episodes. It really deserves its own episode, but we will be doing that later on after we cover the general history of the Book of Mormon. But I did actually make a Wikipedia article. I wrote a Wikipedia article about this city, and I will be linking that in the description so you guys can kind of go ahead and read it. You'll notice as you're reading it just the incredible amount of correspondences between Santa Rosa and the city of Zarahemla. So that covers this episode for now. I just want to thank everyone for sticking around till the end of the video. I know a lot of this information might be familiar to those previous Book of Mormon scholars who've done a lot of their own research into the Book of Mormon and its history. I hope to give a broader understanding for the average viewer of the general area of the Book of Mormon in chronological order before diving into more detailed evidence and correspondences within the Mesoamerican region. That's kind of why if it seems like I'm glossing over a lot of the information, it's because I want to kind of get through it relatively quickly, so that way we can start getting into detail, just the incredible correspondences between each of these cities and what we read about in the Book of Mormon, and just the history of this region in general. For the next episode, you can look forward to us covering early Nephite history, the early Nephite period in the land of Zarahemla specifically. I really look forward to continuing the series, and I hope to see you all in the next video. I'll see you guys soon.